Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
From time to time, I mention police officers on this channel, and whenever they do bad things, it hits the news. And so people often send me stories and Steve, did you catch this happening in this police department? This time it's in California. 54 current and former CHP officers charged with overtime fraud at the East LA station. So Richard Winston wrote this for the LA Times, and California Attorney General Rob Bonta on Thursday announced theft and fraud charges against 54 former California Highway Patrol officers in connection with an alleged multi-year overtime fraud scheme at the East LA station. The charges come 2 years after the CHP relieved of duty dozens of officers working in that station, following investigators gathering evidence that they exaggerated the number of hours they worked on protection details for Caltrans workers doing freeway repairs. So many officers were removed. The agency had to restaff much of the station. Meanwhile, the Attorney General says the officers face a combined 302 counts. 302 counts against 54 current and former officers, including charges of grand theft and the presentation of a fraudulent claim. The amount of money at stake here is $226,000. So $226,000 in pay that the state says should not have been paid. The AG says trust is a critical part of successful law enforcement. These defendants disregarded the law through their alleged actions and did so without thought of how their conduct would impact the California Highway Patrol or the community that trusted them to protect and serve. I'm thankful to CHP for its thorough investigation and for working with DOJ to hold these officers accountable. In May of 2018, the CHP launched its investigation into overtime fraud, which was alleged to have occurred between January 1st, 2016 and March 31st of 2018. Officers are accused of padding their overtime hours during that time span when assigned to provide protection detail for Caltrans workers. The officers were paid through the Maintenance Zone Enhanced Enforcement Program, or the Construction Zone Enhanced Enforcement Program, which are designed to protect workers who work on the freeways. Scores of Caltrans workers have been killed and hundreds injured over the years, primarily victims of errant motorists who have plowed into work crews on the freeways. So working on freeways is dangerous. Everyone knows that. And so because of how dangerous it is, they decided, well, we're going to assign some California Highway Patrol officers to go out and be at these sites and do what they can to make the site safer. And they apparently allotted some money in a couple different programs and said, if necessary, you can do overtime out there, which is not bad pay. And so the allegation is that somehow when these programs are being run, there were officers claiming to have worked hours that didn't work and so on. According to the AG, an officer would, for instance, record and receive pay for 8 hours of overtime rather than the 3 or 4 hours actually worked at a detail. The job typically involves sitting in a cruiser at the end of a construction zone to ensure motorists don't get too close. So if you're driving along and you see road workers on the side of the road, you're supposed to pull over and give them a wide berth. However, if there's a cop car right here, there's a really good chance you're going to say, oh, I need to pull over. And it's more likely you're going to react, I suspect. At least I'm sure that's the thinking. Also, if somebody does do something inappropriate, there's a police officer there who could then go over and do what they need to do. In addition to the main scheme alleged, 3 of the former officers also are accused of recording fake hours for patrolling carpool lanes. According to the AG's allegations, the officers made up fake warnings and reports of assistance to drivers to support their fraudulent overtime claims. So they would file a report and say, I spent so many hours out there and I was helping this person or that person. And since no tickets were issued, there wouldn't be a full-blown report on what had happened, right? So the AG began filing the charges at the beginning of this month. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department booked the officers on February 15th, 16th, and 17th. Yes, it took 3 days. The AG refiled charges against 9 defendants who were the subject of previous charges filed back in 2021. All of the current and former officers are due to be arraigned in March on the 17th and 18th in Los Angeles County Superior Court. 2 of the 54 current or former officers were arraigned in May on conspiracy charges and 3 counts each of accepting a bribe in connection with a bribery scheme. The 2 allegedly accepted bribes in exchange for falsifying documents to register exotic gray market cars. And I'm not going to get too heavily into this, but you've heard of a black market, and that's often where things that shouldn't be sold are being sold. Gray market in automobiles is a reference to vehicles that have issues that might be correctable, but might not be correctable, and it depends on whether you're talking about state or federal. But for instance, a vehicle that's sold in another country might have the speedometer, back in the days of an actual speedometer as opposed to a digital readout, but a speedometer that reads in kilometers per hour. And so to get that car into America, you may have to swap that speedometer head out. At least in the old days, you had to. And they'd often refer to those as gray market cars because there was a bit of stuff you had to do legally to get them into the U.S., and people would often cut corners on it. So one of the things that often has to be done in some states for a vehicle to be brought in and registered, despite the fact it's never sold in America and is a gray market car, is that somebody's got to examine it to make sure that whatever the issues were that would make it not legal to be in America originally have been fixed. And some states assign that task to the police officers, often the state police. And also, it can be a situation where vehicles that are damaged and deemed salvage, when they're put back on the road, likewise, the state police are often the government body that does that. So presumably, if you were a crooked police officer in that position, and you're looking at a car that shouldn't pass, and someone says, hey, I'll flip you a couple $100 if you make this car pass, well, that might be what some people are accused of doing here. So again, the 2 allegedly accepted bribes in exchange for falsifying documents to register exotic gray market cars. Former LA County District Attorney Steve Cooley, who represents many of the officers in civil proceedings, said they are innocent. And of course they are. They are innocent unless and until they get convicted at trial. The attorney says, the AG does not know what he's doing when it comes to these cases. He is being poorly represented by deputy attorney generals assigned to the case. He will discover sooner or later the California Highway Patrol's conduct is unacceptable. They are selectively prosecuting and terminating from one station, all because of a legitimate labor grievance, and this is a retaliation of biblical proportions. So their attorney, at least an attorney defending some of these officers, says, hey, this is all about a labor dispute, and they're being retaliated against, and so we'll see you in court. Meanwhile, the sheer number of officers charged and the scope of the practices alleged make it one of the largest and most widespread such cases involving law enforcement in decades. So Richard Winton wrote the story for the LA Times, and 54 current and former CHP officers charged with overtime fraud at East LA Station. So it's all out of one station, and it's 54 of them. So it's obviously, according to the allegations, a big problem, but as their attorney points out, he says, no, we don't think it's a big problem at all. We think it's just retaliation because there's a labor issue here. So we'll see what happens as this goes along. One of the concerns you have as an attorney, if you're defending such a case, when there are 54 defendants, you know, and I know, that when there's 54 defendants, conducting 54 trials would take a lot of time. Now, they might not have to conduct all 54 separately, but there's a good chance that a lot of them are going to be separate trials, and possibly all of them. It's possible. So if you're the prosecuting attorney and you got 54 defendants, there's a good chance you can look at this and go, okay, let's rank these from most egregious to least egregious. 54 defendants. If we had to let somebody off lightly, they'd be down here. Does somebody down here know something that they could testify about regarding people at that end of the scale? If so, you ask that person's attorney and say, would they be willing to testify? If they're willing to testify, we might go easy on them, cut some kind of deal, and instead of having 54 trials, we'll have 53. But your guy will testify at one of those trials. And that's the concern you have as a defense attorney. Now, likewise, if you're defending one of the people who has lesser charges against them, you might be tempted to say, hey, are you interested in such a deal? Because if so, I can go talk to the prosecutor. And we might be able to work something out. So that's the biggest concern you have if you are a defendant in a case like this with 53 other co-defendants, is what's going to happen if people start flipping. So that's the real big question. And so if you said, Steve, once again, prognosticate for us. Look into the future. What do you see happening here? What I see happening, if I had to guess, and again, I'm just guessing. If I'm wrong, I was just guessing. If I had to guess, a bunch of them are going to flip, a bunch of them are going to cut deals, and a few holdouts will go to trial. What happens to them? Don't know. I don't know what kind of evidence they've got against them. We'd have to see that. But I doubt we're going to see 54 trials. Okay? So there you go. Headline, 54 current former CHP officers charged with overtime fraud at East LA Station. Vern, Josh, Devin, and Marilyn sent it. Thanks a lot. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. Common sense is instinct, and enough of it is genius.